Watercolour can be challenging to use because there's so much to learn. In this video, we'll take a look at some of the reasons why painting in watercolour can be difficult, and I'll share a few tips that might make it a little easier. I've been painting in watercolour for 12 years now, and sometimes I have success and other times my paintings disappoint me. When that happens, it makes me feel like I'm not making any progress. It happens because watercolour is not easy to use. It has a mind of its own, and we need to learn to understand it better. I think a lot of the problems that people have when they first start using watercolour is that they aren't familiar with its characteristics. If you've painted in other mediums, you might try to paint in watercolour the way you are used to painting, and watercolour doesn't work like other mediums. It's different, and you will need to alter the way you paint. One of the characteristics that makes watercolour such an exciting and fun medium to use is its fluidity, but it's the fluidity that can cause the problems. Because watercolour is fluid, it moves around on the paper, and that means that you might feel like you're not in control of what the paint's doing. It can be unpredictable, and it can lead to unexpected colour mixes or unwanted blooms where the drying pigment is disturbed. You could have an idea of what you want your painting to look like, but the finished painting can take on a look of its own. If you are a beginner, you might struggle with the wetness of the paper when you're working wet on wet. Either you have the paper too wet and the paint flows out of control, or you might not have it wet enough and the paint doesn't bleed over the paper like you want it to. Sometimes you could be working on wet paper and you might paint a little more slowly and hesitantly, and the paper starts to dry and you can't get all the wet on wet work done. Because we use water to thin the paint and adjust tonal values, you have to think about how fluid your paint mixture is, as well as how wet your paper is. Is it too thin and light, or is it too thick and dark? And then there's your brushes. How wet should they be? There's so much to think about, and there's a lot that can go wrong. So what can you do? You need to become familiar with watercolour's fluid nature, and to do that, you need to experiment. The first thing you can do is learn about the different degrees of wetness of the paper. I did a little experiment with a strip of scrap watercolour paper. I divided the paper into 10 sections, and I numbered the sections from 1 to 10. I mixed some paint for myself, and then I wet the paper all over evenly. Then I placed some paint into segment 1 to see how far it would spread. I waited 1 minute and I put some paint in segment 2. I waited another minute and I put paint in segment 3. I kept doing that in each segment. By the time I had reached number 10, 10 minutes had passed. You can see that the paint spreads a lot further on paper that's quite wet, but as it dries, it doesn't spread as far. When you first start painting wet on wet, it's really hard to know how long to wait before you put the paint on the paper. And that will depend on what you're trying to do. It takes experimentation and practice to get to know the different levels of wetness. Get yourself a watercolour journal and practice in it. Do what I did there. Look at the sheen on the paper and you'll see it slowly becoming less shiny. That's what you need to take notice of. Another characteristic that is unique to watercolour is its transparency. With watercolour, you can create luminous, delicate and layered effects that are not achievable with other painting mediums. The transparent nature of watercolour allows artists to layer washes of colour to create depth and detail. As each layer is applied, the underlying colours remain visible, and that helps to create a sense of depth and richness. Transparency is what makes watercolour so appealing, but it can also make it a challenging medium to use. Because watercolour pigment is transparent when thinned with water, every layer that you paint remains visible, and every time you paint a new layer, you're making that area darker. If you're a beginner, you might make an area of your painting too dark without realising. Too many layers will take away the transparency and luminosity is lost. If you have ever watched a master artist paint, you'll see that they have this ability to apply watercolour paint confidently. and they can do it with minimal brushwork and layers. They seem to instinctively get the tonal value right at the start, and they can effortlessly apply it using just a few swift strokes of their brush. Sadly, I can't do that. My approach tends to begin with a lighter touch. I progressively layer details and values in my paintings to gradually get to where I want to be. Layering the paint like I do has its problems because underlying layers can be disturbed if they're not completely dry. So it's crucial to wait until each layer is fully dry before applying another. If the layer underneath is disturbed, it can muddy and alter the new layer. Some watercolour pigments are staining, and when they are applied to the paper, they penetrate into the fibres, leaving intense colour that's difficult to lift. They can be helpful when you layer colours because they will remain vibrant and distinct even when you paint more layers on top. When you're learning to paint in watercolour, I think it's best to begin with a light layer to establish your composition and reserve the white areas. Then apply the midtones, and when they're dry, start to add your darks. Leave the dark areas of the painting until the end because dark colours will lift more easily than light colours. And once they are on the paper, you don't want to disturb them. Another reason that the transparency of watercolour paint can make it challenging to use is because you can't cover your mistakes like you can with oil or acrylic paint. If I made a mistake on one of my acrylic paintings, it was no big deal, I just painted over it. You can't do that with watercolour. If you make a mistake and allow the paper to dry, it becomes quite difficult to fix the mistake. So for that reason, it's important to make sure your drawing skills are well refined to avoid any potential errors. It's also important to plan out the order of your washes before you begin. Think about where you want soft edges and where you want your hard edges to be. Some mistakes can be corrected by lifting out when the paint is wet. Other mistakes can be wiped away with a wet sponge once everything is dry. You could also try adding some gouache to your painting. Gouache is opaque and it can also be used to cover some mistakes. However, if you do make a mistake, more often than not, it's best to leave it alone and accept what it has given you rather than try to correct it. Here on one of my failed landscape paintings, I had just finished painting on the shrubs behind the cows, and I went to soften the edge along the top, and I had too much water on my brush. The water rushed in and disturbed the drying pigment. I didn't mean to create a bloom there, but it became my favourite part of the painting. So every mistake is a stepping stone to understanding this medium better. And sometimes a mistake might lead to unexpected beautiful results. Another characteristic of watercolour paint that I often struggle with is how the paints dry quite a bit lighter than how they look when they're wet. There's a saying among watercolour artists, if it looks right when it's wet, it's wrong. We use this saying as a reminder. It encourages us to consider how the paint will look once it dries rather than relying solely on its wet appearance. When you're painting, you need to account for the eventual drying back of watercolour pigments and make adjustments where you need to. While you can paint over an area that isn't dark enough, it's such a shame to have painted a beautiful fresh wash of colour somewhere only to find that it's not dark enough. I can't tell you how many times I've done that. I tend to paint the colours on my paper too pale and then I have to keep layering. I'm learning to change my ways though. When I'm painting areas of a painting where they will stand on their own with very little further work needed, I try to make those areas dark enough with one wash of colour. With this black cockatoo painting, I made sure the initial wash of colour over the wing area was dark enough. I didn't want to have to layer another wash over the top when it was dry because the first wash is always the freshest. I added some feather detail work on top of this initial wash when it was dry, but I didn't layer a second wash all over it. Another crucial aspect that's important to learn about when painting in watercolour is timing. Mastering timing can significantly impact the outcome of your painting. When working on wet paper, success depends on the moisture level of the paper. If you apply the paint while the paper is too wet, it will flow uncontrollably. If you wait too long, it might be difficult to blend. Understanding the different levels of wetness is crucial, and this relates to the characteristic of fluidity. Timing is important when you want to lift paint with your brush or with paper towel to create highlights on wet paper. But if you try to do it too early while the paper is quite wet, it will flow back into that area and the highlight will be lost. If you try to lift paint when it's starting to dry, you may not get the desired result that you want either. Timing is also crucial when you want to create special effects such as blooms or salt texture. Sometimes I put salt on the paint when it's too wet and I don't get the results I want. Other times I might be too late putting it on the paper. Success hinges on your timing and understanding the wetness of the paper. Developing a sense of timing in watercolour painting requires patience and observation. By paying attention to how your paint interacts with the paper at different stages of wetness, you can make informed decisions about when to apply it, when to blend, and when to let the paper dry. Watercolour is challenging, but success will come if you have patience, if you persist, and if you experiment. I was an acrylic painter, but I lost interest in it. I tried watercolour, but I didn't understand it. I was trying to paint in watercolour the same way I painted in acrylic. I gave up after a few weeks. It was too difficult for me. The interest in learning never went away though, and a few years later I tried again, but this time I persisted. I had patience with myself and I experimented. I have to say the reward for my dedication has been worth it because painting in watercolour is such an important part of my life now. Painting in watercolour, unlike painting in acrylic, consistently excites and surprises me. While I don't think I'll ever master it, the journey of learning itself brings pure joy. If you take nothing else from this video, take this. Becoming proficient in watercolour comes about because you made mistakes. You experimented, you took risks, and you learned from them. I hope this was useful to you. If you want to learn more about painting in watercolour, head to my website where I have information about my online classes. You'll also find lots of useful articles I've written that will help you with your watercolour painting. Thanks for watching. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you again next week. It's frustrating. All the no. And there's a lot that can go wrong.
Sorry.
To use. You right there? Shall I do that bit again?
Yes, 19 minutes left.
Need to cough? Ah! Stop stressing me.
You might not get the desired result. Quick, 8 minutes.
I'll see you next week. I got a tickle.